Welcome to Scary Production, your gateway to the most spine-chilling horror stories and unnerving tales. Dive into a world of darkness where every shadow hides a secret and every whisper tells a haunting story. From ghostly encounters to unsolved mysteries, we bring you the finest in horror content designed to keep you on the edge of your seat. Are you ready to face your fears? Subscribe now, and let the terror begin. The scorching heat of Lahore's afternoon sun filtered through the intricate wooden jharokas of the Qureshi household, casting long, shadowy fingers across the once bright walls. The family home, passed down through generations, was a grand, ancient structure that stood on the outskirts of the city. Its high walls and dim corridors whispered of stories long buried in the folds of time, stories that had been forgotten or purposefully ignored. It was the summer of 1992. And the Qureshi family had just moved into the ancestral home after the passing of Dadaji, the family patriarch. The house had been vacant for over a decade, its silence undisturbed except by the occasional gust of wind that rattled through its old, creaking wooden windows. Ali, his wife Rabia, and their 3 children, Saad, the eldest, Aisha, and little Hassan, had been eager to move in, feeling a sense of pride in inheriting such a grand property. The first few weeks went by smoothly. Rabia busied herself in decorating the house, bringing it back to life. She loved the sprawling rooms with their high ceilings, the intricate floral patterns carved into the walls, and the beautiful Persian rugs that covered the cold marble floors. The house, though aged, still retained a charm that spoke of a bygone era of wealth and prestige. But there was one room in particular that unnerved her, a room at the far end of the second floor, which the family referred to as the sitting room. It was here that an enormous, ancient portrait hung, a painting of a stern-looking man dressed in traditional Mughal attire, his sharp eyes seemingly following anyone who entered the room. The portrait was old, older than anyone in the family could remember, and no one seemed to know who the man in the painting was. Dadaji, when asked in his later years, had always brushed off the question with a vague smile and a wave of his hand. The painting unnerved everyone, especially little Hassan, who had refused to go near the sitting room since the day they had moved in. At night, the creaking of the old house seemed to amplify as the wind howled outside, and Rabia often found herself waking in the middle of the night, her heart pounding for reasons she couldn't explain. One particularly sweltering afternoon, while Ali was at work and the children were at school, Rabia decided to clean the sitting room. The air was thick and oppressive, and as she entered the room, an inexplicable chill ran down her spine. She paused, her eyes drawn once again to the portrait. The man's eyes seemed sharper, more focused, almost as though he was staring directly at her. Shaking off her unease, she started dusting the shelves, her movements slow and methodical. As she wiped down the furniture, the sound of a soft, almost imperceptible whisper filled the air. Rabia froze, her heart hammering in her chest. The house had always been quiet, eerily so, but this was different. It sounded like something, was trying to speak to her. She turned slowly toward the painting, dread creeping over her like a dark cloud. The air in the room had become stifling, and she felt an overwhelming urge to leave. But something kept her rooted to the spot. The whispering grew louder, though the words were still unintelligible. It was coming from the portrait. Suddenly, the door to the sitting room slammed shut with a deafening bang. Rabia jumped, her breath coming in shallow gasps as she bolted for the door. Her hand shook as she twisted the old brass knob, but it wouldn't budge. Panic rose in her chest, her mind racing with fear. She pounded on the door, screaming for help, but the house remained silent. And then, in the stillness, she heard it, a voice, clear and menacing. "Leave." The word echoed through the room, freezing her blood. Her eyes darted back to the portrait, and her heart nearly stopped. The man in the painting, he was no longer sitting in the regal pose she remembered. His head had turned, and his dark, hollow eyes were locked on hers. Rabia's scream pierced the silence of the house, and in a desperate frenzy, she yanked the door open, her breath coming in ragged gasps as she fled down the hallway. She didn't stop until she was in the kitchen, her hands trembling as she tried to steady herself. What had just happened? Was she losing her mind? When Ali returned that evening, she told him everything, her voice shaking with fear. but he dismissed her story, attributing it to the stress of moving and the heat. "It's an old house, Rabia. Old houses creak and groan. You've just been spending too much time alone in here." But Rabia couldn't shake the feeling that something was terribly wrong. The children, too, had started complaining about strange noises at night, footsteps echoing through the hallways, whispers in the dark. Even Hassan, who had always been a sound sleeper, had begun waking up in the middle of the night, terrified and crying about the man in the picture. It wasn't long before the tension in the house became unbearable. The children refused to go near the sitting room, and Rabia found herself avoiding it as well. She began to notice things, small, unsettling details. The air in the house was always thick and heavy, and at night, it felt as though someone was watching them. Shadows flickered in the corners of her vision, disappearing as soon as she turned to look. Objects moved from where she had left them, and there was always that incessant, low whisper, just on the edge of hearing. One evening, as the family sat down for dinner, there was a sudden crash from the sitting room. The sound echoed through the house, sharp and jarring. Ali frowned, setting down his fork as he rose from the table. "I'll go check," he muttered, though his voice held an edge of uncertainty. Rabia stood too, her heart pounding. "No, don't." But Ali was already walking toward the sitting room. Rabia followed him, her fear growing with each step. As they approached the door, the air grew colder, and she could feel her pulse racing in her temples. Ali pushed the door open, and they both froze. The portrait had fallen from the wall, its heavy, ornate frame shattered into pieces on the floor. But it wasn't the broken frame that held their attention, it was the portrait itself. The man in the painting was gone. The canvas was empty, the once stern figure now nothing more than a vague outline, as though he had stepped out of the painting. The room was suffused with an unnatural cold, and Rabia's breath fogged in front of her. She grabbed Ali's arm, her fingers digging into his skin. "We need to leave," she whispered, her voice barely audible over the sound of her own heartbeat. Ali nodded, his face pale as he turned to gather the children. But before they could take another step, the door slammed shut behind them with a deafening bang. The lights flickered, casting erratic shadows across the room, and the low whispering began again, louder this time, more insistent. The air grew thick with an oppressive force, and Rabia felt as though the walls were closing in on them. The room seemed to pulse with a dark, malevolent energy, and the whispering grew into a chorus of voices, all speaking at once, their words unintelligible, but filled with rage. Ali pounded on the door, shouting for the children, but his voice was drowned out by the cacophony of whispers. The temperature in the room dropped further, and Rabia could feel a presence, something cold and ancient, looming behind her. She turned slowly, her heart racing as she came face to face with the man from the portrait. He stood there, no longer confined to the canvas, his dark, hollow eyes fixed on her. His presence was overwhelming, filling the room with a suffocating dread. Rabia backed away, her body trembling with fear as the whispers rose to a deafening crescendo. And then, as suddenly as it had begun, the whispering stopped. The room fell into a heavy silence, broken only by the sound of Rabia's ragged breathing. The man from the portrait was gone, and the door creaked open slowly. Rabia and Ali fled the house that night, taking the children and leaving behind everything they owned. The house remained abandoned, its windows dark and empty, as though it had been waiting all along for someone to come and disturb its slumber. But even as they left, Rabia knew the truth. The man in the painting was not gone. He was still there, watching, waiting for the next family to move in.